Hi folks, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. Today we have AVI Cathcart and Darrall Thompson. We will be looking at reframing assessment. This time it's personal. So AVI and Darrall, would you like to begin, please?
Thank you, Matthew. We'd just like to start by thanking Matthew and Jess Chris from the Transforming Assessment team and Candy Woodfield and Sam Elkington from the Higher Education Academy in the UK. We're sitting here in Brisbane, and we thought we'd begin by talking about our key reflections on when we were first asked to do the seminar and what immediately struck us. The first debate we had is whether there needed to be more work in this space. If you care about learning and teaching in higher education, and you read the latest articles in HEARD and assessment and evaluation, you go to conferences and participate in webinars, you read papers by scholars like David Booth, Sue Bloxham, it's easy to start to believe that the vast majority of people who teach and support learning are actually in agreement, that they believe that assessment matters, that it should be used to promote learning, not simply summatively, that all students in theory should be able to excel, that feedback should also feed forward, and that curricula should be constructively aligned and that intended outcomes, learning activities and assessment inextricably connected. Of course, we've got different opinions on how best to structure assessment, the correct balance of formative and summative, the limitations of criteria and so on. But there's quite a lot of evidence in Australia, in the UK, and of course elsewhere in the world that we're making good progress in this space. But then we started to reflect on some of the conversations we've had with colleagues at both our own institutions and other institutions internationally. And that highlighted a slightly different story, one where assessment continues to be contested and is experienced in ways that are deeply personal and often problematic. In this webinar, we plan to present a number of scripted dialogue or conversation catalysts, all based on real discussions we've had or observed in Australia and in the UK, and designed to help us reflect collectively on the barriers and enablers of transformational change in relation to assessment practice. Before we share our first conversation with you, what we'd love you to do is to cast your mind back to your first experience of being assessed as a student at university. We'd like you to try and remember the first marks that you received. And if you feel confident doing so, we'd like you to post that number in the chat box. I'll start by posting mine.
Which is already on the screen here as well. Okay.
I can see some of you are doing that, and it's amazing how easily those numbers and ratings come to mind.
Great.
We'll encourage you to keep on doing that, but while we're doing so, we'd like to start to show you our first conversation catalyst.
I'd like to get your advice on my subject. I just got the student evaluation results, and I can't believe I'm a 3, especially after all that effort my tutors and I put in, giving them feedback on their assessments. I'm sick of repeating the same comment on these assignments. For example, don't just bolt your references on as a list at the end.
So what do you really want them to do?
Well, I want appropriate references with citations integrated into the text to support their argument, not just bolted on as a list at the end.
So if you're making this comment on lots of assignments, your message can't be getting through.
Well, I've told them often enough, and I've told the tutors to tell them too.
I see that your instructions said minimum of 5 references to be included. Didn't they do that?
Well, yeah, but they should have realised. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Anyway, will get them in the exam because that's worth 60%.
So this assessment is worth 40%, and I see you've written a marking guide with rubric statements for each grade. It's certainly comprehensive. What is it, 12 pages? Do you actually give this to the students?
Yes, but clearly they don't read it, and in any case I feel like I'm spoon-feeding them.
Could it be that this is so complicated they just can't work out what's important? If I look at the rubric marking sheet, you've ticked some of the boxes and then you've come up with a percentage mark. Could you tell me how you get to that mark?
Well, it's fairly obvious based on the ticks.
Well, hang on. This one's ticked 2 fails and 2 credits. So how do you calculate the total mark?
Well, the tutors make a professional judgment. That's what they're paid for, isn't it? And in any case, students just look at the overall mark at the top anyway.
So do students ever query it then, or try and challenge the marking?
Yes, but thankfully the university rules are that they have to show a procedural error or miscalculation. So actually we can ignore most of them. And if it's an exam, I tell the tutors, look, you have to write comments to justify your marks in case of appeals, but don't worry too much about the feedback. And we don't have criteria rubrics for the exams, so students never see the comments anyway, unless they appeal, of course.
So going back to your basic message about referencing, it's clearly frustrating for you and taking up a lot of time that you could be using for research.
Well, that's right, and it feels even more frustrating when the tutors and I have spent our weekend marking and the students don't even bother to collect their assignments. I mean, look at the pile left over from last semester.
Is that because you publish the results online?
Who knows? I just feel I can't go on like this, spending all the weekend avoiding my family so I can finish writing all that feedback, which they don't even bother to collect. And what do I get in the end of semester feedback? A 3.
What we'd like to do now is pause the conversation at that point and invite you to join in the dialogue. So we're interested in your feedback and reflections on both what you've just heard and specifically in relation to these 2 questions. We'd love you to comment in the chat feed. Okay, so we can see that there's some comments here, particularly around examinations, in particular in the way exam boards sometimes operate. So I'm looking at a comment there saying that students shouldn't be able to get more than 7% on an assignment. How negative is that?
Yes, absolutely. And the next part of the conversation we're going to show is actually relating to that as a possibility.
Catherine's making an important comment here, which is that by the time students get to university, they've been trained to focus on marks. That absolutely fits with some of Darrall's research on the backwash effect of assessment.
Yes, strictly speaking, we say, or it has been said, assessment drives learning. Really what assessment does is actually divert the attention of the student away from learning. And the assessment really is a governing factor. One of the issues raised in that first little dialogue is the idea that the number for the student survey about the subject is actually owned by the academic, who say, I'm a 3. But actually assessments should be challenging anyway, so maybe they got that mark for producing an interesting and challenging learning activity.
So we're about to show you our second conversation catalyst. We're aware some of you had some audio problems with that first one, and we'll apologise for that. What we're going to do after the webinar is make a video link available so that people could replay that if they wish to. It's great to see actually that a lot of the comments here are entirely in line with some of the ideas that we're hoping to get across to you in this next link. This is conversation 2.
Conversation 1, Part 2.
So, what's the secret to getting the decent scores on students' evaluations then? What have you done in your subject?
Well, for starters, I've reduced the exam weighting down to 30%, but I actually think the main change has been to try and focus the students away from marks and instead get them to think about development.
Sounds nice in theory, but how do you do that and still publish 3 papers a year?
There's no easy answers. I use a marking and feedback program called Review, and the time-saving trick here is to write assessment criteria as feedback statements. What was that feedback you said earlier? References with appropriate quotes integrated into the text to support your argument. And we could even put in brackets, not just bolted on at the end like a list. And we can link that directly to the graduate attribute categories and the programme or the course learning goal categories.
Yes, but if they won't even read the rubric sheet, why would they read this online stuff?
Well, here's where your feedback wording gets to them. We can ask them to use these grading sliders to self-assess against each of the criteria before they have to hand in. You can tell them that the research shows that students practicing this get better grades than those that don't.
Yes, but will they do it?
In my experience, once you've shared the fact that students who self-assess actually improve their performance, I find that the majority are keen to give it a go. And students like the idea of using the same system that the tutors are going to be using.
But doesn't that unfairly influence the tutors?
No, because the tutors only see the self-assessment after they've saved their own marks.
Well, I like the idea that students have to take notice of what I'm telling them in this self-assessment, but I still think most students will just give themselves all high grades.
Ah, first-year boys. Well, the point is that when first-year boys go in to look at their results, 2 things happen. First, they see that there actually is no mark available yet, only the criteria with the grading sliders. So they have to focus on them and the feedback in order to see how they've done.
Ah, well, I bet they get a shock when they see their own high distinction self-assessments alongside the tutors that tell a different story.
Yes, the evidence we have is that they're much more thoughtful when they self-assess the second time. The challenge is to keep it personal. Own the criteria by wording them with what you actually value. For example, appropriate level of jargon and explanations given the target audience.
So why would students actually buy into this?
Well, first, because they get to fine-tune their assessment by self-assessing before they hand in the work. It's reminding them what's going to count. Second, I've told my tutors that if they see a self-assessment, they should tailor their feedback to address the gap between the student's self-assessment and their own. Students get personalised feedback to help them develop. And finally, they can get a printout, a PDF of their actual progress or results in a pie chart or a graph form, and they can show that to potential employers.
Hi, Abby. We lost the sound.
Okay, sorry about that. We just had a small technical challenge at this end. And what we wanted to do there was to get you to see an example of one of the ways that we're trying to get students to engage with self-assessment, particularly at a number of universities in Australia. So we're using there to illustrate the review software program, which is, for those of you who participated in last month's webinar, was explained in some detail by Danny Carroll from another Australian institution. We're using Review here not to recommend or to promote the particular software, but really to just suggest a way that self-assessment can be used to get students to more meaningfully engage with some of the assessment criteria. What we'd like to do now is to hand over to you again and to get some of your comments and feedback on the questions which are on the screen. So how can we use self-assessment to empower learners, but also to get some ideas about what works well in your institution. Review, as I say, is just one way of supporting self-assessment. We'd love to hear about some other tools.
Right.
Yeah, Matthew, I see you're talking about self-assessment against criteria as a manual activity in a class. But again, that's something that we've done at QET using tools like Go Soapbox or Turning Point Responseware or Clickers to get students to self-assess through marking exercises we do live in class.
Yeah, the issue is to try and get students to actually engage with the criteria and self-assessing before they actually hand in the work. That aspect of being able to fine-tune what they're doing and looking at what the actual criteria are that are really statements of value, what's actually being valued in a particular assignment. So absolutely, engagement is the key.
An interesting comment here from Jim Harris. Precognition test, place posit I'm not aware of, but that's an interesting something to look up later. Self-assessment on video elements, I like that idea.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Ross's comment there about using it not simply as a vehicle for feedback, but to get self-assessment as a starting point for one-to-one feedback is a fantastic point. We're very keen to use self-assessment as a way of tailoring the kind of feedback we provide to our students here. So we focus our time on speaking to them about the gap between their own judgment on their performance in a task and our judgment on that performance in the task.
Yeah, as was mentioned in that little video, particularly the slides, we have found that students actually that practice this as a normal part of the embedded feedback and assessment process, they really do improve their grades against those who don't. And but embedding that as a normal part of activity is where software can really help. Okay.
Yeah, I love that idea of self-assessment as a way of promoting curiosity. Again, to use an example from one of my classes in the really big core first year units here where we have about 500 students, what we find is that there's a moment where we get them to do a marking exercise during the class and to mark as if they're the tutor a dummy assignment. That very act of marking and then immediately sharing the gap between their judgment on how they would use the assessment criteria and our judgment on using the assessment criteria, that moment is incredibly powerful in making them very interested in the process that the tutors go through when they're actually marking assessment tasks.
That's a good point, Matthew. Students actually find that assessment is not as easy as it looks. And that's actually where the interesting, the wording of assessment criteria, Sadler points out that you can't actually really ever capture exactly and completely exactly what you're valuing through an assessment criteria. There needs to be a conversation. So partly the self-assessment process actually helps students engage with that, and often they do post queries about the actual assessment wording, what they actually mean.
I'm intrigued by this idea of doing the dummy marking exercise in the class without the rubric and then repeating it with the rubric. I can see it can be powerful, and I'm just wondering in what way. So I could see, the power both in terms of getting the students to explicitly comment on the things they think we might be looking for when we're marking assessments, and then comparing that with the things that we actually say we value through our criteria and through our rubrics.
One of the most interesting examples was we tried doing some self-assessment in the lecture theatre, so letting students kind of point and say, yeah, we'll give them a fail, and using the criteria engagement there with a large audience, with the tutors there was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, okay, so I think we're going to get ready to show you another short conversation catalyst here. This one is a little bit different. It's aimed at really reminding us, in line with the title of our presentation for the webinar, what the personal consequences of assessment might be.
Conversation 5. It's that time of year again. I've had 2 students in tears and a third who looked as if they wanted to punch me.
Yes, I know what you mean. Good job we're all working in glass cubicles where everybody can see in nowadays. Imagine being in a confined space with all that angst to deal with.
Feels worse than ever to me this year.
What caused the angst for you?
Basically, they weren't happy with the marks. She told me she was a distinction student. She's never been a credit in her life. I told them it wasn't personal.
Oh, I've had that too. Because they focus on the overall mark, they don't even look at the criteria to work out which bits they need to improve.
One even brought up her friend who had passed, but she felt hadn't worked nearly as hard. She didn't think it was fair.
Well, let's face it, she's not alone in thinking that effort should be the main criteria.
Yes, it's interesting this because really when we look at this idea of marks being taken personally, and the teaching professor blog mentioned in the conversation referred to in that debate about whether effort should count. And we hope that our catalyst has prompted some reflection on both that question of personal effort and the broader issue of marks and feedbacks being seen as a label on the person, not on their work, which is really where that label fits. We'd really welcome your comments on this in the text box if you can.
So the question is, how do we stop students taking it also personally? Or in fact, should we try to stop students taking it personally?
Yeah, that's another good comment, Matthew.
Yeah, it's a nice idea that we're commenting on work, not on the person themselves. So we often find that when you get your own review and comments back on a journal article that you've spent months and months developing, that despite knowing it's about the article, not about you, that isn't necessarily how it's received.
Yes. When you actually look at what's being valued in an assignment, really effort is invisible to the marker. We really don't know how much effort, or we can certainly look at what kind of effort and certainly what capabilities are evident in the assignment produced.
I really like that idea that what we need to do is encourage students to contribute to the rubric themselves. Of course, this lends itself very much to this idea of students as partners, helping them see the point of the rubric and less inclined, therefore, to, I do like that word, whinge about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually that's a lovely point, Kerry. So this idea being that talking through the points of the feedback can actually help the students receive it in quite a different way. The sense that sometimes the way we write is shaping a response from students that may not be the response that's intended. I mean, similarly with speech, of course, as well. So Joe's comment there about it being the type of feedback delivered along with the mark video, audio delivering additional cues that written words don't, I think is important. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a push, I would argue, internationally for us to become less personal, more impersonal with the way we provide feedback. So, for example, anonymized marking would be the perfect illustration of this. Whereas many of the comments that I can see going through the chat stream at the moment are actually pointing to something different, using your personal voice, speaking directly to a student. And that kind of, I think, reflects some of the contradictions that we're dealing with.
One of the things that students really value that we found in our research is that a general comment about how the group did or how the cohort did in various aspects of the work is really valued by students. It's really the sense of, yes, you did well on this aspect, but generally people didn't address the argument well. And so it's actually quite interesting that they also appreciate generic feedback or general feedback about the actual task. Yes.
Melanie's point there from the University of Tasmania is just reflecting on cultural overlays as to how a student accepts or not, or doesn't accept feedback. I wonder if you'd like to say anything more about that, Melanie? Any specific examples for it?
Yeah, the mention of ATAR scores is a really important one too. Most universities are very complicit in only accepting students from a number, and the number is absolutely no indicator of the quality of the course, really. It's just the cut-off that applications will go to. So, interesting.
Yeah, thanks Melanie. So Melanie's clarified she's thinking particularly about students where English is a second language or where there are particularly high expectations from family, which of course speaks really highly to many of the challenges that students are encountering, you know, well before they pick up their assignment marks and feedback from us. That sometimes there's just immense pressure going on in students' lives, and remembering that, I think, is actually an important thing for all of us to do when we're starting to craft feedback and feel some of the frustration about feeling we're having to make repeated comments when we feel we've already clarified that through teaching.
Yeah, good point, Jim, about how do you balance personalised learning and sustainable in large cohorts. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is where using software and actually trying to engage the students in the assessment process, where at least they can have a time prior to handing in the work where they do engage with what's being valued, it tends to kind of give them the sense of being involved. And I think that engagement is really important. However, if you're really going to do an analysis of that, it's still going to leave you can't really do a huge amount of personalised feedback. What people have tended to do is actually have standardised comments that are pasted in. That's okay. Actually, in the software review, what it does is put the student's first name up there front in the comment box. So a little bit of personalisation will go a long way.
Kerry, if I can just respond to your comments about the marker, looking at a sample paper and talking to that.
Yeah.
It could be helpful in terms of how students read and hear and read feedback. I was inspired years ago when I worked in the UK by a seminar by Phil Race, where he talked about the importance of providing feedback. I think his plan was within 24 hours. And having first of all said, that's ridiculous, how can I possibly respond to 500 people within 24 hours? I realized there are ways of doing it. So one of the things I do is within several hours of the assessments being handed in, I do post online some feedback on performance, and you can do that, I think, by looking at just a couple of papers. The point being, of course, it's too late for that assessment for those students, and you can do similar things as a formative activity earlier in the semester. But At the moment when students have handed in, that's the moment they're very much open to learning, and therefore I think it's a chance to develop them if we're really serious about trying to engage them in assessment which goes beyond a single task.
Yeah.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is return to one of the ideas we started with, which was really reflecting on constructive alignment and whether we really are preaching to the converted. Darrall and I really are suggesting that constructive alignment may well be one of the most influential ideas in higher education, but we really do believe the academy is deluding itself if it thinks that the principles are fully embraced by everybody who teaches and supports learning. Alignment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's shaped by the institutional climate and the human pressures on students and on faculty members. We thought we'd illustrate this drawing on a resource that QET's Teaching Advantage team developed. So this was a newspaper article which was published in the Australian newspaper a couple of years ago now, and it's illustrating for us both the sense of student as customer, but also the increasingly sophisticated understanding of the contract between the learner and the educator, and the sense that students can and will contest decisions when they believe the contract's been broken. Academics are facing pressures from all sides, for example from institutional student evaluations of teaching metrics, as well as from non-official but nevertheless increasingly used sites like ratemyprofessor.com, which we know is used initially in the US, but is definitely finding its way into Australia and I suspect elsewhere as well. Ratemyprofessor.com, of course, amidst many commentaries on charisma, looks, dress sense and accent, does actually occasionally include feedback like this complaint which went to court in Australia, which speaks to the growing expectations of students that curriculum will be constructively aligned. One of the debates we had about this quotation, which comes from the article about the lack of alignment between the stated objectives of the unit, the curricula, the criteria, the assessments, and the pointed comment about the legible comment from the tutor. One of the comments, the discussions Darrall and I have had about this is, you know, who prepares that student? You know, that student knows more about constructive alignment than I believe many of our academic staff do.
Absolutely. So
it's surprising, or really I think our question is it surprising that there's a lack of alignment given the pressures that we're all experiencing in our daily academic lives? I wanted to draw the community's attention to what I think is a really lovely article by Inga Newman and Pitt at Australian National University. This piece of research analysed a set very recently, a set of academic job adverts, which were adverts for positions at either associate lecturer or lecturer level. So really looking for early career academics. For many cases, it would be people's first academic job. And what the research pointed to was just the incredible expectations that employers, namely institutions like ours, are placing on the most junior academic appointments. So the research is basically showing that those adverts are asking for people who have A, a PhD, B, have published, C, have got teaching experience and can articulate a teaching philosophy, and D, have brought in industry grants, E, have got management or authentic real-world experience, and you know, I can go on and on and on, and in fact the paper does.
absolutely.
Really what we're saying is that we are being pressured to behave as if we were superheroes, and that pressure is going to have an impact on the way that all of us engage with assessment. We may well buy into principles of constructive alignment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be enacting those principles in our daily relationships with students and indeed with our peers.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. And ultimately, looking at Biggs's classic diagram of constructive alignment, You have the teaching learning activities, intended learning outcomes, assessment tasks. But Biggs also actually identified this issue of climate. What actually is this being put together in terms of the climate of the institution? So missing from those common explanations are the principles of alignment. Two critical components that Biggs did actually identify in his book. The climate we create in our interactions with students, the institutional climate, the rules and the procedures that we actually have to follow. So for example, to illustrate how climate matters in shaping the way students engage with assessment, when students are searching on a course catalog, for instance, and I actually sat with a student doing this, the very first thing they see in one particular institution's example is a fee schedule. So straight away, that climate that we're producing is one where they're a customer, they're buying a subject, and this has led to students working out how much a particular lecture is costing, and so that's even before they read the objectives of the subject.
I'll just pause, we've got a small technical challenge with our screen share. Yes, we're back.
Okay.
Great.
A second example, as we saw in the first conversation catalyst, was that the student evaluation score on the teaching or the subject is often actually taken personally by the staff member themselves. And indeed, despite the institutional rhetoric around it being a developmental process, developmental feedback, it's often used punitively by management through the performance reviews. So that's really part of what we're thinking about, and perhaps in your institution as well. What are those climate considerations that Biggs started to reveal when he was talking about these three aspects? The other aspect that we really wanted to bring forward, and we're arguing that crucial to constructing assessment practices that truly represent Biggs's vision here, is a consideration of people, the humans that use and shape the system. That's the academics themselves. Often there are learning designers involved, the tutors, of course, who need to know and feel close to those subject assessments, and of course the students. So assessment actually, as an example, it's very personal. Academics and students experience it that way. Therefore, using assessment criteria to express what we really value is a great way to communicate. If those can be written in that form where you're clearly making a statement in common language, not highfalutin academic language necessarily. So a good illustration of this is the growing but problematic contracting out of writing feedback and associated rubrics. So often, if an academic adopts a subject or has to take on a subject written by someone else, then they're adopting someone else's wording for those criteria, for the rubrics. Now that's okay, and you need advice on the clarity with which one can express those values. But what the academic is valuing and really espousing to the students really should be foregrounded in those criteria. And that can only happen if they're allowed to be part of the shaping process. The academic lead, all right, in consultation with expert professionals, they need to ultimately feel that they own those criteria, so that when they're actually talking about the assessment, talking about the task, that sense of value of what they're really looking for in that task comes through to the students straight away.
A second way that we were really thinking about the human dimension and this theme of the personal experience for staff and students is in relation to in Australia we call them the student evaluation scores, but effectively we're talking about the evaluation of teaching surveys, usually delivered at institutional level and increasingly or dominantly distilled into a single number, which is then assigned to an academic or a course for a semester's worth of work. We're arguing that student feedback scores on teachers and on subjects are powerful instruments in institutions. They're capable of being used for good, of course, but they're also capable of being used punitively. One way in which this is being challenged at QET is through our revised evaluation strategy, which requires all faculty to use multiple forms of evaluation. And actually, one of the great strengths of our approach to evaluation here is trying to give academics ownership of evaluation. So we're required to use multiple forms, but there's a whole range of those forms which have been officially endorsed by the institution. That gives them a certain power when academics are providing evidence about their evaluations using those forms, like peer review of teaching or instant response, for example, in discussion with their supervisors. These are really ways of gathering more meaningful and, we'd argue, much more personal insights, which means evaluation of teaching can actually be used to promote learning rather than simply to track something. Students are not customers, the passive receivers of a product, but rather partners in learning. Convincing them that this is the case when we've got upfront fees and structures that reduce them to the single number is shaping the view of the student, the view the student has of themselves and their view of education, and missing, we'd argue, the opportunity to promote deep, critical reflection on what we value. So a key way that we think this can be challenged across the broader community is by opening up dialogues and conversations about the power of self and peer assessment, where we can work towards calibrating judgment on performance in ways that transform the way that students engage with learning.
Yeah, I like Noel's comment there about, yes, from the 1980s, yes, the assessment system of an institution is its truest statement about its real values. So you can go for 100 years of exam-based assessment and see where the value actually lies. And I think I came up with a criteria once for one academic when they put forward their exam, which was, also what you're really valuing is the ability to reproduce and regurgitate memorized information within a time constraint using handwriting. So, you know, this is actually what is being valued in many, many institutions. Still,
it's emphasising that policy practice gap, you know, the rhetoric that we may all buy into, but the difference between that and the practice that our students and our colleagues are experiencing in every day.
So, thank you for all your comments. This is really a wonderful, rich engagement, actually.
It's somewhat technically challenging.
Technically challenging. I want to just briefly, you know, looking at the key ideas from this workshop, return to this idea of a single number. There is a whole culture that students have grown up with in Australia, 13 years of trying to get this single number. And what this does is actually it causes a powerful backwash effect, which can often neutralize the effort we put into the teaching. And as I said before, assessment could be said to drive learning, but actually what it really does is focus the attention of the student perhaps away from what the wonderful engaging learning we're going to have into what is really in the exam. So that backwash effect is illustrated every time a student asks us, well, is what we're doing in the exam? It occurs every time the assessment fails to reflect what we really want students to learn, and it sends them a signal that the things we're teaching are actually not important. What's important is what's in the exam. So one of the ways of trying to retain, instead of the conflation of all the differential aspects of a student's performance into one number, so try and open that up. If assessment criteria are linked to meaningful categories of development for students, that culture of the single mark that lumps together the development capabilities and actually obscures the variation in individual performance. We're not suggesting a mark should disappear. That would be a whole, 10-hour webinar. However, we are suggesting that marks need to be carefully aligned with capabilities evident in the work, not in the person. That's the issue. It's not personal in that sense. It's personal about the evidence in your work, but not personal about you as a label. So criteria-based self-assessment, if we can do it, it needs to be taught They need to know how to do it, and developed, so that students learn to calibrate their judgments, and it builds their confidence in the capacity to perform well. This might be through the use of self-assessment systems like review, or through lecture mapping exercises like using clickers, as AVI has done fantastically at HEA.
I think really what we're trying to suggest is that assessment criteria will always be contestable, and that teaching teams and students need to provide with opportunities to discuss and to critique them. And I think that's our theme here, that you know, drawing on many of the great scholarship in this space, the importance of dialogue and conversation around this. If we're really going to be serious about building this broader academy of people who care about learning and teaching, academics are not superheroes. We're ordinary people, and we're subject to the pressures and stresses of everyday life in the academy. Striving to frame meaningful assessments while complying with institutional agendas, work intensification, and of course pressures to perform. Creating a culture in the academy which embraces reflective practice in relation to assessment is crucial to that. And that can happen in multiple ways, through engagement with systems like the UK Higher Education Academy Fellowship Scheme. We're now engaged with that at QUT, and really the power of seeing our staff members, including some very unusual suspects as opposed to just the usual faces, writing and reflecting on their practice in assessment and feedback, using the HEA framework to engage with that, has been really very, very powerful. The key here for us is communities of practice, informal discussions in the tea room, top-down institutional strategies, and bottom-up colleagues just sharing some of the challenges and difficulties of teaching and assessing. The key is enabling people, we believe, to give voice to their values, to the challenges they're facing, and to their concerns, so that we can collectively shape the way that we're supporting learners. At the start of the session, we invited you to share your single mark, to illustrate what happens to people when they're reduced to a single number. A number that encourages you to compare yourself with others that may have the same number, but may have very little else in common in terms of the specific capabilities evident in their work. The label becomes something that we experience personally. That's why I can remember mine from, I think, 20 years ago, probably more than that, in the UK. The number is you, not simply a judgment on your performance as an assessment task. So I think our final comment here is assessment is personal. It's personal for staff, it's personal for students, and labels do stick.
Absolutely.
We'd like to end by thanking you for participating. I'm really looking forward to looking back with a bit of space to reflect on some of the comments that you've posted in the chat screen. We'd like to also add our thanks to Andrew Francois at University of Technology Sydney and Gareth Simpson at QUT for their fantastic technical support and expertise. Any errors are Darrall and are mine rather than anybody else's. We'd like to thank Matthew Hillier from the Transforming Assessment team, Jeff Chris, as well as Candy Woodfield and Sam Elkington from the Higher Education Academy for inviting us to speak and for their support leading up to the event. We're hoping we can continue the conversation across this growing international academy.
And as was mentioned in the introduction video, we are attempting to produce quite a number of conversation catalysts, which we're recording and animating with the help of our technical staff. So it's an ongoing journey.
Hi folks, this is Matthew again. I'm just coming back just to finalise those two slides. So there's some references I'm going to put there so that they're into the recording for the session. And the second page. So So we will be posting the recording on our Transforming Assessment website like we normally do, and that will include the text box as well. If you get to fill in our feedback survey, please do that. Much appreciated. So there's a link to the feedback survey. So thank you, Abby and Darrall. Very interesting session and very engaging for the group. We see lots of discussion there.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording, but people are welcome to stick around. So once again, thank you, Abby and Darrall.